Going. All righty. Okay, everybody. I'd like to welcome um, author of Cooking with Scraps, Lindsay-Jean Hard. And I'm going to throw it to her.
All right, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here this evening and talk to you all about reducing food waste and why you should care about it in the first place. So we're going to go through a few slides together, and then since I'm now at home, I'm actually going to bake some banana bread, and you can see firsthand about making it while reducing food waste. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so first thing right off the bat, I want to talk about what cooking with scraps means. And it does not mean any of these things that you're looking at. Cooking with scraps does not mean you're eating garbage. It does not mean that you're dumpster diving, and it does not mean that you are eating moldy food. So what exactly is it? Well, scraps are underutilized produce parts and other odds and ends that often get discarded. So that can be a lot of different things. That can be stems, like from herbs and mushrooms, broccoli, kale. That can be cores, like from apples and cauliflower. It can be rinds, like from melon or cheeses. Peels, like bananas, beets, apples, citrus fruits, tops, all sorts of root vegetable tops, the leafy greens from carrots, beets, radishes, and then other odds and ends like pickle brine or spent coffee grounds or aquafaba, the liquid that comes in a can of beans. So if this concept seems familiar to you, it's because it likely is. It's become more popular again recently, but it's by no means a new topic. Throughout the ages, across lands and cultures, people are no strangers to making the most of what they've got. It's, as you probably know, heavily impacted by factors like generation and culture and socioeconomic status. Some of us are probably already really thoughtful about food waste, while others of us might be in a position of privilege enough that we really don't have to think twice about it. So if a recipe tells us to cut off and discard a kale stem, we might be doing that without really thinking about it. So hopefully this will help you start to change your mind with that. I work at Zingerman's Bakehouse, and for those of you that are familiar with Zingerman's, you might know that we have what's called a triple bottom line. So at Zingerman's, that triple bottom line is great food, great finance, great service. All three of those are equally important. I like to say that cooking with scraps has a triple bottom line too. It's good for the planet, it's good for your pocketbook, and it's good for your palate. And I start with your palate because that's really the most important thing. Flavor comes first. It has to taste good. I'm not going to be telling you to eat anything that doesn't taste good. And at the end of the day, these are really just ingredients like anything else that you're cooking or baking with. It's good for your pocketbook because of the money that you're literally saving when you're not throwing all of these things away. Families of 4 on average can save anywhere from $1,600 to $2,200 a year by just simply not throwing away food. And then it's good for the planet because currently around 30 to 40% of food in the United States goes uneaten. It's a staggering number every time I say it. It just boggles my mind. And a very small portion of what we call of that surplus food is donated or recycled. Most of that becomes food waste. So the impact to the environment, as you can imagine, is enormous. All of that food still required resources to grow, to harvest, to transport, to cool, to cook, or otherwise prepare, even when it ends up getting disposed of. And food waste is actually the #1 material entering landfills. And 24% of landfill inputs is food. And as you can probably guess, if you take a minute to think about it, food in a landfill is a really bad place for food to be. There's no oxygen, there's no sunlight. So it's creating methane gas, and it's taking a really, really long time to break down. I don't know if any of you have seen the documentary Wasted. I recommend it if you haven't. I was blown away. It takes 25 years for a head of lettuce to decompose in a landfill. Just really staggering. So on that note, I want to touch on the EPA's food recovery hierarchy. It prioritizes actions to prevent and divert wasted food. And it's really geared not towards home use so much, but more like corporations and businesses. But I still think it's helpful for us to go through just as a way of thinking about food waste and what's happening to it. So you can see at the top level of this hierarchy, those are the best ways to prevent and divert wasted food because they create the most benefits for the environment, the society, and the economy. And the bottom levels are the worst. So you can see at the top, we want to be reducing the volume of surplus food generated to start with. We want to be feeding hungry people. We want to be feeding animals. But then I think what's really interesting is compost is just one step above the landfill. I compost at home, I garden, I love composting. I'm never going to tell anyone not to do that, but I think it's really helpful for us to think about the fact that composting is nowhere near the highest and best use for food waste. We want to be doing all of these other things first, and at home, we can definitely be doing those top two things on the hierarchy. So now I have a little pop quiz for you. It should be fairly easy if you were listening to me on like my second slide. I listed off a bunch of these, but I'd just like you to take a minute and read through this and think about what you think is not edible. And you can either just think it to yourself, or if you feel like it, you can share in the chat what you think you can't eat. Give you just a couple more seconds to get through all of them there. There are some on there that are not edible. It's not a trick. All right, check yourself. Were you correct? So the vast majority of that list is completely edible. The only things on there that are not edible are green potato peels, because they have a toxin in them that if you ate a substantial amount of them would make you feel sick. But you can just cut off the green on green potatoes and continue to eat them. Moldy bread, as I said early on, I'm not encouraging you to eat mold. So nothing on there that's mold, other than cheese is mold, but no visible mold growing on your food. And then the last one there is rhubarb leaves, because those are toxic too. But all of these other things you can eat and turn into delicious things. So apple cores, you really don't need to core your apple in the first place. I have a colleague at the Bakehouse who eats his apple from the bottom up, and he is simply left with seeds at the end of it. So it's an example of how we get used to things. There is, yes, a little bit of a different texture to the apple core, but everything other than the seeds are edible. You can also, if you really don't want to eat the core, you can save them, and then you can cook them down and like make applesauce with them, or use it to flavor like tea. Again, you'd want to remove the seeds and not eat those. Avocado pits. Those, I have 2 little avocado trees growing in my windowsill right now from avocado pits, but they are actually edible themselves too. You can dry them out, and I've heard of people putting them in smoothies if you have a very high-powered blender. You can also use them to make like a type of liqueur, and they can be used to dye fabric too. Banana peels, we are going to talk about more later, but completely edible. Beet greens, like I mentioned, the leafy greens of any root vegetable. Broccoli stems. This is one of my favorites, and I feel like this has been the biggest difference that I've noticed in the grocery store just in the past few years, that it used to be you would just see the crowns, but now you're starting to see more of the broccoli with the stalk itself, which is nice. You can use it exactly like you would use the florets. You can saute them, you can roast them, you can shave them and turn them into a slaw. Carrot greens have a reputation that they cannot be eaten. I will sometimes hear people say that's not true. They are just a little more bitter than some other greens are. Completely edible though. If you don't like the bitterness, you can blanch them and that will help remove a little bit of the bitterness. Cheese rinds, you don't want to eat anything that's man-made. So you don't want to eat wax, of course, or plastic, but if it's just cheese itself with the cheese rind, that is all completely edible. I have one bag in my freezer with Parmesan rinds that I will use to drop into stocks and broths or a pot of beans. And then I have another one going that's just a mishmash of all sorts of different rinds and like any little cheese nibs that you might have at the end of like a party on the cheese plate. And then I use those to make a cheese spread. You can just blend them all up together. Coffee grounds still have a surprising amount of coffee flavor left in them after you make a pot of coffee. And so you can put those to use and still get the coffee flavor. I like to mix some in with like almond butter or other nut butters, and you get a really nice texture and coffee flavor in there as well. I also like to infuse cream or milk with the coffee flavor, and then you can use that in desserts. Corn cobs, I will admit this one is a little bit of a trick question. You're not actually eating the entire cob, but there's still a lot of corn flavor in the cob. If you're cutting the corn off for something else, you can save those. You can make a corn cob stock that then you can use for soups or risottos. Kale stems, as I mentioned earlier, there's no need to ever cut off and discard this. I like to just chop it up more finely. If your recipe is going to have you cook your kale, maybe you're starting with onions, you can go ahead and cook the kale stem along with your onions and then add the kale leaves in a little bit later. Orange peels, a lot of you have probably had candied orange or lemon rinds. That's one of my favorite things to do with them. I also, if I know I'm going to use or just eat the orange, I will zest the orange first. And I like to use ice cube trays in my freezer as a way to store lots of little things. So I will freeze some orange zest in an ice cube tray and then pop it out and just have baggies full of stuff. You just want to make sure you're labeling it so you know what all of these fun odds and ends are in your freezer. Pickle brine is delicious and useful. In my cookbook, I use it with a potato salad and in some Bloody Marys. You can also use it to pickle something else. Just make a quick batch of fridge pickles with that empty jar of pickle brine. Pumpkin guts. Many of us are maybe roasting those seeds at Halloween, but the guts themselves are edible too. And I like to lightly cook them a little bit and then blend them and use them like you might like mashed banana or applesauce in quick breads. What do we have next? Stale bread. Stale bread is, I think, the most useful scrap there is. Like for people that have not gotten into this at all, I think this is my favorite gateway scrap to recommend that you get started with. Again, I have bags in my freezer. I will do some grated to make them be breadcrumbs, and then I just have breadcrumbs on hand in the freezer. I also like to cube bread and have a baggie of that in the freezer as well. So then you can make homemade croutons at any time. It's really easy to just toast them up in a pan with some olive oil, maybe salt and pepper or some spices. Adds a lot of great texture to dishes. Bean liquid, that's the aquafaba that I mentioned earlier. Most often when people say aquafaba, they're talking about the liquid in a can of chickpeas, but any bean liquid will work the same way. It will also work if you're cooking beans at home, though if you haven't worked with aquafaba before, I recommend starting with the liquid in a can of beans. It's just a little less finicky to work with. but it behaves remarkably like egg whites. So you can whip it up, you can use it like you could, like it can function as an egg replacer. So you can use it in baked goods. I've used it to make an egg-free mayonnaise before. You can make meringues with them. Really a fun ingredient to play around with. Watermelon rind. Watermelon rind pickles, I think, are the most common thing that I hear people use this for. I like to turn it into a granita, like an icy dessert. It's really refreshing because it's still very watery, just like the watermelon itself. So you're not using the very outermost green part, but you're using all of that white middle part of the rind. And then zucchini stems. This is one of those like kale that I think we've just gotten really used to, that we chop off without thinking about it. It is a different texture than the zucchini fruit itself, but it's still edible and tastes like zucchini. It's delicious. So now some concrete strategies for you at home to think about for reducing food waste. My first one is to meal plan. And this is one that I personally resisted for a really long time. We have a great farmer's market in Ann Arbor. We have more than one of them. And I love to go to the farmer's market and just wander around and buy whatever catches my eye. And I would initially feel resistant, like, I don't want a meal plan that I can't go buy all of the things at the farmer's market. But I've learned that I just need to come home from those trips and then take a few minutes to figure out how I'm going to use them. And then it ends up making my, supplemental shopping trip more efficient, because I'm only getting the ingredients that I need to complement those vegetables that I got at the farmer's market. And I know what I'm doing for the whole week. The other part of that is, hopefully we're turning a corner on the pandemic. We're going to go out to eat again and visit with friends. And so plans come up during the week and your plans change. You had something planned for dinner. Now you're going to go out. I recommend taking the time to think about that and how that impacts your meal planning. Like, do you need to roast your vegetables and get them in the freezer? Or is everything going to be fine for another couple days? Just taking the time to assess what you have and what you need to do with it. And then circling through your fridge and your pantry once every week or so you keep an eye on what's in there and you don't let the things hiding at the back of the crisper drawer melt into spinach goo, that you're always aware of what you have. Which is my second point, is proper storage. So it's a big step towards reducing waste, is to store your food properly so it stays fresh for as long as possible. It maximizes the time that you have to use it before it spoils. One easy way to think about it, if you're not sure, is where did you pick this up in the grocery store? Was it out at room temperature, or was it in a cooler case? Is your first step of where should I be storing this at home? In general, most produce is going to last a lot longer for you if you store it unwashed. The caveat to that though is to know yourself. If you are going to be more likely to eat all of those greens you bought if you wash them, then that's fine. You can take that step and wash them. It's just balancing out which way is going to work better for you. For greens, I like to wash them in a salad spinner, and then I just leave them in the salad spinner because there's enough of that little moisture residual at the bottom that it helps them stay fresh and crisp, but they're not sitting in any water. If you don't have a salad spinner or don't want to take up that much space in your fridge, I like to loosely wrap them in like tea towels and then put them in a plastic bag or other storage container. Herbs. Herbs are one of those things that I feel like you buy for one dish, you use a tiny amount of it, and then they just die on you before you're able to use all of the rest of them. So for soft stemmed herbs like parsley and basil, dill, I always think of them like a bouquet of flowers and just put them in a glass of water at room temperature. They're going to be happiest that way. You can put them in the fridge if you'd like, ideally like loosely covered with a plastic bag over the top of them. But basil should definitely stay out on the counter. Don't put that one in the fridge. Woody stemmed herbs like rosemary or thyme, I treat like I do greens. So loosely wrapping them after washing in a tea towel or paper towel if you go that route, and then in a storage container. And then, as I touched on earlier, I really recommend putting your freezer to work for you. It's just a great space for, I call it the dumping grounds for scraps, but it's a dumping ground in the good way, that you have all of these things at your disposal that'll take your dishes up a notch, like having the zest, having those croutons, having the Parmesan rinds that you can add to broth. You just want to make sure that you're labeling everything really well. I like to use a Sharpie on masking tape and then put that on freezer safe containers or ball jars or freezer safe plastic bags, whatever you're using, because you might think right now that you can tell the difference between your basil pesto and your carrot top pesto that you made, but I can tell you from experience that a month from now, there's no way. So just help set yourself up by putting that on there, and the date too is always helpful. So then you're checking that when you're cycling through your fridge and pantry and being aware of what you have. And then my fourth and final tip is a couple of ways that are my favorite ways to use up odds and ends. The first is stock. And stocks are a really great way to use all of the things that you can't figure out what to do with. Again, I like to have a couple of dedicated freezer bags in my freezer going. You can make stock with full vegetables, of course. I prefer to use as much of the vegetable as possible and then save like the very scrappiest of scraps for my vegetable stock. You can also I like to have dedicated bags for the vegetable stock too. So like corn cobs, I would keep on their own to make the corn cob broth. And then the winter squash, those guts can be used to make a stock too. It'll be cloudier and murkier. So you might not want to mix that in with your other vegetables, but it still makes a really delicious, flavorful broth. And then strata, which you see pictured, is a really versatile dish for cleaning out odds and ends, and it's make ahead friendly. So you're using those chunks of stale bread that you have, and then other random veggies that you have that you maybe roasted for a meal earlier in the week, little odds and ends of meats or cheeses. And I think it looks and feels like you put more time into it than you really need to. So next, how I hope that my book, Cooking with Scraps, can help you make a difference in your journey of reducing food waste. As hokey as it sounds, changing the food system really does start in your own kitchen. Because if you're cooking, you're more likely to be making wholesome choices and be more connected to your food. And the more that you know and care about your food, the more likely you are to eat sustainably. And the more sustainable you are, the less food that you waste. So my book, Cooking with Scraps, is intended to function like a reference guide for the often unused part. I figure if you are buying the carrots already at the farmer's market, you know what to do with the carrot, but you might not know what to do with the greens. So it's organized alphabetically, and you can just flip to it and get ideas for how you're using that how you're using that piece of produce or other odds and ends. And I really hope that Cooking with Scraps functions as a jumping off point for you, that once you learn what you can do with these things, you'll apply it to your own favorite recipes, or you'll tweak these recipes and you'll make it your own. For the most part, they have very simple, short ingredient lists, really familiar ingredients that should be easy to find in any major grocery store. The one slight exception is that I spent a couple of years living in Japan. So you will notice a Japanese influence in some of the dishes. But again, you should be able to find those in any major grocery store. The other thing that you'll notice, especially if you're a baker, is that there aren't any metric measurements in my cookbook. This was a conscious choice. I am a baker, I prefer to bake by weight. I will talk about that when we get to the banana bread next on why that's so important. But for my cookbook, the vast majority of these recipes just don't call for that level of precision. And if Cooking with Scraps is new to you, I want to make this as approachable as possible. I feel like it can get overwhelming for people. So these are all things that I did to help make it feel really easy to dive in and start using more of these ingredients yourself. So I think this sums it up really well. We don't need a handful of people doing zero waste perfectly. We need millions of people doing it imperfectly. So that's my goal together, that we can reduce food waste by making small changes in our kitchens and spreading the word about it. And now I am going to share Zingerman's Bakehouse banana bread recipe with you. As soon as I can stop sharing. The recipe is available on blog.bakewithzing.com. You can just Google and you'll be able to find it too. Okay. So this is one of the things that I was most excited about. It's one of the most popular recipes in my cookbook is a recipe for a banana peel cake. It's modeled after a cake that my grandmother would make. That's was my favorite birthday cake for her to make for me. And it uses just the banana peels. And I started working at Zingerman's Bakehouse right about the time that this cookbook came out. And so I shared this concept with my boss, and Zingerman's Bakehouse was already really great about reducing waste, but not necessarily food waste as much. And so I feel really privileged to have started to have a hand in reducing food waste at the Bakehouse. So we no longer peel carrots for our carrot cake. We don't peel apples for our apple pie. We use coffee that's left over in our gingerbread coffee cakes. And now we use the whole banana, peel and all, in all of the banana breads that Zingerman's Bakehouse makes. So since the cookbook has come out, I have learned that it is easier to freeze your banana. So I have my banana that I froze and thawed. So in the cookbook, I have you cooking the peels to soften them. But now I've learned that if you just freeze it and thaw it, that does the softening for you and it saves you a step. So anytime you're eating the peel or the whole fruit or vegetable, you want to try and buy organic whenever possible. Or you want to be going, we don't grow bananas, obviously, in Michigan, but for things that we do grow, if you're going to the farmer's market, you can talk to the farmers about their growing practices. Maybe they aren't officially organic, but they use those practices. So you can buy produce that you feel comfortable eating. So my organic banana, you can either, a lot of the times the ends will just like twist right off. You just want to get rid of the very bottom part. Or if it doesn't, you can use kitchen scissors or a knife, and you're just going to get rid of just that very end. And then you're going to get rid of the stem at the top too, just because it's dried out and it's harder and it won't blend properly for me. So mine was in the fridge or in the freezer for one night, so it still looks sort of brownish. Yours might be completely black. It's totally fine if it's completely black. It won't affect the final bread at all. You can also do this, like if you make a smoothie in the morning, you can use your frozen banana. You can just chop it up and do the peel and all. So I'm just going to chop it into chunks to make it a little bit easier. I use an immersion blender. You can also use like a little food processor, but the whole thing gets blended up. And when I first did a test and brought in samples for my colleagues to try, universally across the board, they were like, I don't know about eating banana bread with a peel in it. And every single one of them commented about how much more of intense banana flavor the banana bread had. So it's been really great that not only, we wouldn't make this change if it didn't taste good. That's obviously the first and most important thing, but it tastes better. And we're now reducing food waste at the same time. We've drastically reduced the amount of compost that we're creating because we're using the whole banana. So I'm going to tilt you down now so that you can see what I am doing. And it will just be loud for a second as I blend up my banana. I just use the container that came with my immersion blender because it's nice and deep and it makes it easier for blending that up. And that's it, just a few quick pulses. And I get this banana puree. And you can see that there are some darker flecks in there. That is totally fine. When you have banana bread, it looks sort of flecked anyway. This one just looks perhaps a little bit more flecked. But unless you told someone, I don't think there is any way that anyone would be able to guess what is different about your banana bread. I'm going to set that aside. So this is where baking is where you really want to be working with weight, if at all possible. I've measured out all of my ingredients ahead of time. I have nothing fancy. This is like a $15 scale. But if you don't already bake with weight, this is going to make the biggest difference for you in your baked goods. If you've ever had something not come out quite right, chances are that it is due to the fact that you are baking with volume instead of baking with weight. So for the first example is the all-purpose flour that we're adding. That is normally the biggest culprit. For starters, there's no standard 1 cup equals so many grams for 1 cup of flour. Everyone has their own different thing, ranging from 120 grams to 140 grams, which is what ours is. But also, if you are just scooping your flour into your cup, you can drastically change how much flour is getting into your cup because it settles and packs down. So always want to do weight if possible. We are then going to add some baking soda and some sea salt. We're just going to whisk those together. And then we have an egg. The Zingerman's Bakehouse recipe calls for an extra large. If a recipe calls for large, extra large, those can generally be used interchangeably. And I always recommend cracking on the counter, not cracking on the side of the dish, because you're a lot less likely to push. If there's any contamination on the outside of the shell and you crack on the edge, you're pushing it into the egg. You're more likely to get it into whatever you're baking. And I always recommend breaking it into a separate container, because if anything is off with your egg, you'll be able to see it immediately and you haven't mixed it in with the rest of your dish yet. So it's a lot easier to just get a new egg than it is to start all the way over. So I'm going to add my egg into my banana. And then we've got some melted butter. I'm going to add that into melted and cooled, so it's not hot. And then some vanilla. And this recipe is Zingerman's Banana Bread makes theirs in the little mini ones, little mini pans. So it's like a 8 by 4 inch. And I don't tend to have those at home. So I am just going to use a regular 9 by 5 standard one. It will make a shorter and squattier loaf. It still tastes delicious. It just looks, you know, a little shorter. But you can also double this recipe if you have the larger regular sized loaf pan and you would like it to look more substantial. And then we're using 136 grams of sugar, which I also measured ahead of time. I'm gonna add that in too. And if you wanted, you could add in, you know, like a half a cup of chocolate chips or nuts too, if you like that in your banana bread. My daughter always lobbies for the chocolate chips. And then you're just going to mix these two together. And this is a do as I say, not as I do, but you probably saw me just now preheat the oven. You always want to give your oven at least 20 minutes to heat up, ideally longer. If you have a newer oven, it might beep at you that it is preheated in like 5 or 10 minutes. I recommend ignoring that beep and really giving it 20, 25 minutes to make sure that it really has had the time to come up to temp. And I also recommend getting an oven thermometer, because other than the differences of weight versus volume, that is the next biggest culprit of if you're having issues with things that you're baking not coming out quite right. It could be due to your oven temperature not being quite right. And if you have the oven thermometer, then it's just a really easy way to check and be able to calibrate and fix that yourself so you know what you can be baking at. And so we're just mixing until we no longer see any flour or any dry ingredients in there. You don't want to keep going after that fact, and also want to scoop up and under. That's where the flour and other dry ingredients tend to hide, at that bottom of the bowl right there. And then I have just sprayed this lightly with pan spray. And then I'm just gonna pour it in. And it'll take about 40 minutes to bake. Of course, if you were doing a double batch of this to get a taller loaf, it would take longer. And then spread it out a little bit, and I will pop it in the oven once my oven is preheated. And there you go. That's the Bakehouse banana bread. So now I am happy to answer any questions that you all might have about cooking with scraps, about specific ingredients.
Yeah, I think somebody in the chat asked if it was okay to chop up your bananas in the peels before you freeze them rather than after they're frozen.
Mm-hmm. Yep. You do want to be using very ripe bananas, like the type that you would use for banana bread anyway, even if you weren't going to use the peel. If you are using, like my bananas that I have right here are way too green. It won't add flavor to whatever you're making with it. If it is all the way ripe and just plain yellow, that's fine, but you really would like the ones that have the brown spots that are very ripe.
Yeah, and have you used banana peels in smoothies?
I've done the whole banana.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be kind of a hard sell with my husband because he gets weird about things like that, but we'll try.
It could be a fun test. Like, guess what's different about this morning smoothie?
Yeah. Well, he usually makes them. So that's the
Oh, okay.
problem.
That's a little harder then.
Yeah. It's hard to get that past him. But
Lindsay? Yeah, first of all, thanks very much. I really appreciate it. Secondly, could you just repeat the three items that we don't want to eat? I got the potato greens and the rhubarb leaves. What was the third one?
Moldy something, moldy bread.
Thank you.
no mold.
No mold on anything.
Oh, somebody wants to know if the banana bread recipe is in your book.
No, the banana bread recipe is Zingerman's Bakehouse, and that is on their website, blog.bakewithzing.com. In my cookbook, there is a recipe for a banana peel cake, which is where I got the idea to then tell the bakehouse.
Yeah, I put it in the chat, but I'll say it again. The address that you gave for the blog that had that recipe, I'll put that in an email that I send to everybody, along with a link to a recording of this program. So if anybody wants to look at it again to see if they missed anything, then they'll be able to do that. That'll probably happen tomorrow. I probably won't get it on in tonight. But you could expect an email tomorrow with that information in it.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? We had a couple of hints. Jocelyn said, I'm sure most people know how to dry eggshells and sprinkle them on your outside plants on the lawn. And so you're not really eating them, but you're still reusing something that might go to waste otherwise.
Yeah, they are edible though. There are companies that are, upcycling them and turning them into like supplements.
Why not? Especially if you bake them, they'll be sterilized. And
yeah.
Somebody asked, what are your most frequently used scraps and recipes? What do you like to cook the most with your scraps?
Banana peels is definitely one of my top ones. I love carrot greens are one of my favorite ones. That's one of my favorite sleeper recipes in my cookbook, I like to say, where it's like it gets marinated with like soy sauce and sesame oil. And I had a bunch of friends recipe testing for me as I was going through that process. And the ones that I had test that one were like, wow, like this is so good. I never thought about this. I've never eaten my carrot greens before, but that and the carrot top pesto. One of my friends has a private chef business, and they've loved the carrot top pesto themselves too. And they have started using that in meals that they serve, which is really exciting to me. I am a vegetarian. I love cheese, but there's no cheese in that pesto. So it's vegan friendly and it's delicious. I could literally eat it with a spoon.
Yeah. Have you tried the new Miyoko's mozzarella, the liquid mozzarella?
No, I haven't.
Oh, it's a game changer.
Really?
Because we don't cook with dairy, and it's a very new product. And I asked a local store in town here, Greener Pastures, to get it in for me, and they did. But it's like I said, it's you can eat things I never could before. And I saw that strata and I go, oh, I bet it'd be good in that.
Oh, that's fun. I've heard good things about that brand in general. I'll have to try it.
We use the butter too. But
nice.
Somebody, speaking of stratas, another question was, do you have a favorite recipe for strata, and is it in your book?
It is in my book, yes.
And she loves all the info, as she added too. And someone asked you to speak a little bit more about aquafaba.
Yeah, so it's the liquid from a can of beans. Most of the time, people will have you use from chickpeas because it's lighter in color and doesn't have as much of a flavor. But you can use the liquid from any beans. In the cookbook, I use the liquid from black beans in a brownie recipe. But it's really great, especially for baking, or if people can't eat eggs or would just rather not, you can use it like an egg replacer. So like I said, it's in the book with brownies. I also use it in the cookbook to make an egg-free mayo with, meringues.
Yeah. Yeah, I have sometimes if I'm draining a can of beans or I have cooking liquid from beans, I'll freeze it because I know if I don't need it, you don't always need it right then. And I've
Yeah.
had pretty good luck with the egg carton or the not egg carton. Oh gosh, ice cube tray. Thing of pouring
Yes.
some in each one. Then you've got some for when you need I figure one ice cube, maybe an egg or
Yeah, that's great.
Another one commented, I make soups and bread pudding with scraps frequently.
Nice.
Marie, what is it you are asking? What is what called? We've got a question I don't quite know the answer to. I've got another, you were talking about, the mozzarella. I've got another thing with the orange peels is if I can get organic oranges, I dry the orange peels and use those in soups too, especially because I bought from a Chinese doctor in Windsor had a soup mix that he would put together and it had all, different kinds of herbs and things and it had the orange peels in it. So ever since then and it doesn't really flavor the orange. You don't put so much in it flavors the soup, but it really apparently is good for respiratory issues and things like that. So
Nice.
the liquid mozzarella is called Miyoko's. I could also put that in the email. I'll write that down, the spelling. It's a brand of cultured products that replace mostly dairy products. They have cream cheeses and things like that. I'm going to put that in. Okay. Did anybody else have any questions? Oh, nothing's popping up here. Well, I'll kind of, I'll start winding down and then if anything else pops up in the next couple minutes. But I really want to thank you, Lindsay-Jean. It was 2 years of waiting, but it was worth it. I personally really learned a lot and the comments that have been coming through, I think everybody else has learned a lot too. It's good to get a new perspective, I guess, on things, even if you think that you're using all of your stuff, then you realize, oh my gosh, I'd never used banana peels in anything. I guess I always thought it would be kind of astringent maybe or something, but definitely going to try that. We've got some thank yous, interesting and informative. So we appreciate all of your comments and anything else, I will we'll let Lindsay go back to making some banana bread for her lucky family. And again, we really appreciate you being with us. And I hope your check arrives in the mail.
Thank you so much for having me and for being patient for 2 years. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, it's the first thing I thought of when we started. Oh, we're going to start having programming again. So awesome. Great class. You're getting some great remarks. So we really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for coming by. And I'm going to end the program and look for an email tomorrow from me. Thanks, Lindsay.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye-bye. Oh, sorry. Someone wants to know if they can get an autographed book. How would she go about doing that?
Well,
That's a hard one.
Oh, it's totally possible. I often go into Literati in Ann Arbor and sign copies that are in there. But also if they feel like driving to Ann Arbor, they can connect with me and we can figure out a way of making that happen. They can, if you're on Instagram, that's the easiest way to reach me is a direct message on Instagram. But otherwise, maybe you can share my website,
Okay.
your email, and there's a form to contact me on my
Okay.
website.
All right.
But thank you for asking. I appreciate that.
And so where is the literary store? It's in Ann Arbor. What street is it on? I'm
It's
trying
on
to place
Washington.
Washington. Okay.
Yeah, it's right downtown Ann Arbor.
I haven't been there in 2 years either.
We all have lots of catching up to do.
Yeah. Okay. She said that she can go to Literati. She knows it
Okay.
apparently. So we'll go from there. But I will put your website and everything, all the information I can gather together. I'll put in an email and you'll all get it tomorrow.
Great. Thank you so much. Have a good night, all.
Thank you. Good night.